At 23, I thought I was finally stepping into the light. I had just come out of grad school with a degree I'd sweated for, nights of Raymond-fueled study sessions and mornings that began before dawn. And now, standing in the glass tower of my new office in Denver, I had earned something concrete, a promotion barely 6 months into the job. My boss shook my hand, colleagues congratulated me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the word success actually belonged to me. When I called my parents that evening, my voice still carried the disbelief of someone pinching herself. To my surprise, they actually seemed proud, at least in tone. My mom squealed. My dad chuckled that low approving laugh he usually reserved for Jason, my older brother. It was rare to hear it directed at me, and the sound alone felt like a reward greater than the pay bump. For once, I imagined my place in the family shifting. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the shadow child anymore. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. My mother had tagged me in a Facebook post. My curiosity was warm and hopeful. I thought maybe she'd written something like, "Our Emily has worked so hard and deserves the world." I opened it, my heart soft. The words hit me like cold water. So proud of our daughter. With her success, she'll help us fund the revival of the family vineyard. I read it twice, then a third time, as if my eyes were misfiring. My stomach twisted. They hadn't celebrated me. They had drafted me into a plan I hadn't signed onto. I could feel my ears burning, the way they did in high school when teachers read test scores aloud, and mine weren't the ones my parents bragged about. The comments underneath were already rolling in. A cousin wrote, "That's amazing, Emily. Keeping the vineyard alive will mean so much for the family legacy." Another added heart emojis. Strangers to my life, applauding a decision I'd never made. The vineyard. My chest tightened just thinking about it. That land in Napa had once been beautiful. Rows of vines glowing in late afternoon light. Grapes bursting sweet against the tongue, the smell of oak and soil after rain. But all of that belonged to my childhood. In reality, the vineyard had been sinking for years, almost the moment Jason took it over. Jason, the chosen one. Blonde hair, easy laugh, the kind of confidence that filled every room. My parents called him our little entrepreneur, even when his business ideas were nothing more than half-baked dreams scribbled on napkins. He convinced them he was a natural at leadership, that he was destined to grow the vineyard into something world-class. They believed him. They gave him control. And I watched from the sidelines as he turned a steady, modest family business into a money pit. First, it was lavish renovations that went nowhere, then reckless loans for expansions that never materialized. He threw money at marketing consultants and trendy labels, chasing prestige instead of stability. Debt piled up, creditors circled, and yet he always had a way of spinning it. Always a new excuse, always a new plan just around the corner. And my parents? They nodded along, writing more checks, treating him like a visionary thwarted only by bad luck. I knew better. Jason wasn't cursed, he was careless. He loved the aesthetic of success more than the grind of earning it. He posed for glossy photos in the vineyard with a wine glass in hand, while workers went unpaid. He'd host tastings for his friends, bragging about our legacy, while suppliers called weekly demanding their invoices. And through it all, I was invisible, the practical one, the backup plan they never admitted they had. Until that post. Now suddenly, I was the savior. Not because they respected what I'd built, but because I represented fresh funds, a new account to drain. My success wasn't mine to celebrate. It was theirs to appropriate. They hadn't even asked. They had simply announced it to the world, as if I were an extension of Jason's Vineyard, another asset under family control. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow, remembering every time my achievements had been brushed aside. The scholarships I'd won, dismissed as lucky breaks. The internships I'd sweated through, barely acknowledged compared to Jason's networking dinners. Even when I got into grad school, my mom had said, "That's wonderful, honey. Maybe someday you can help Jason with the books." And now here it was, written in digital ink for the whole extended family to see. My life wasn't about me. It was about patching up my brother's failures. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it, something hotter stirred. Anger. Not just at them, but at myself for even expecting this time to be different. How naive was I to think my promotion would finally make them proud of me for me? I closed the app and sat in the dark, phone screen burning against my palm. Out the window, Denver's skyline glittered with the kind of promise I'd fought to claim on my own. But inside, all I could hear was my parents' unspoken decree. "You've worked hard, Emily, so now it's your turn to carry Jason." The shock settled into a cold certainty. This wasn't pride. This was conscription. And I hadn't even been given the choice. Growing up, I didn't need anyone to spell it out for me. Jason was the favorite. It was there in the little things at first. How Christmas morning meant he got the shiny bike, while I unwrapped sweaters, 2 sizes too big. How when he broke curfew, it was boys will be boys. But when I missed a chore, I got a lecture about responsibility. The hierarchy wasn't hidden. It was stitched into the fabric of our family life. The invisible rule book I learned before I knew multiplication. Jason got the best gifts, the benefit of every doubt, the soft landing whenever his ideas went sideways. I got silence, or worse, the pat on the head that said, "We expect you to handle it." And for a long time, I tried to. My brother went through businesses the way some people go through shoes. First, it was a boutique coffee brand, then an eco-friendly clothing line, then some flashy tech startup he barely understood. Each time, my parents were there with the checkbook. They'd say things like, "You have to take risks if you want to be great," as though greatness were guaranteed, as though debt and failure were just noble stepping stones on his path to brilliance. Meanwhile, I was stacking grocery shelves at 15, cleaning houses at 16, filing papers in cramped offices at 17. Every paycheck I saved was a lifeline towards something my parents never thought to give me: independence. While Jason failed forward, cushioned by endless second chances, I built my own safety net stitch by stitch, terrified of what would happen if I fell. And yet, despite the imbalance, despite the raw unfairness, I wanted to help when they mentioned the Vineyard. That land wasn't just rows of grapes and sunburnt dirt. It was the backdrop of my childhood, the one place where favoritism seemed to dissolve, at least for a little while. I can still remember the golden light spilling across the vines in late afternoon, the smell of earth baked warm under the California sun. Summers meant sticky fingers from crushed grapes, running barefoot between rows while our grandpa, Thomas, called after us with his easy laugh. He was the true heart of the vineyard, the one who showed me how to pick clusters without bruising the fruit, who let me climb the wooden press and pretend I was strong enough to turn the wheel. "Careful hands make good wine," he'd say, winking as if I carried a secret talent. With him, there was no golden child. Jason and I were just kids then, shoulder to shoulder, learning the rhythm of the harvest. I loved those days. Loved the rows of sunlit grapes stretching toward the horizon, the sound of cicadas buzzing like a summer hymn, the way the hills turned purple at dusk. For a child who felt invisible in her own house, The vineyard felt like proof that I belonged somewhere. That memory is what made me pause when I saw my parents' post. It's what dulled the sting just enough. When they assumed I'd bail Jason out again, part of me thought, maybe if I helped, it wouldn't just be about money. Maybe it would mean reclaiming that place, that feeling, that connection I'd lost. Maybe saving the vineyard could stitch us back together. I knew it was foolish hope, but sometimes the foolish hopes are the hardest to let go of. So when my parents called about the upcoming family reunion, I didn't argue. I didn't remind them how Jason had drained the accounts before, how he had treated the vineyard like his personal playground. I didn't say that I was still paying off student loans even with my promotion. I swallowed every word because some stubborn corner of my heart whispered that this might be the moment things turned. I imagined us walking the vineyard again, the way it used to be. My father's hand steady on my shoulder, not Jason's. My mother laughing with me instead of at Jason's jokes. I imagined a rare evening where I didn't feel like a guest in my own family. Maybe this time, I'd be more than the backup child, the one called upon only when the golden one slipped. That hope, fragile as it was, carried me to the reunion. I pressed my dress, packed my bag, and boarded the plane with a practiced smile. In the mirror that morning, I'd rehearsed it until it felt almost natural. I told myself I was showing up because it mattered. Because family, despite all its fractures, still carried the weight of blood and memory. And because maybe, just maybe, if I offered my hand, they'd finally see me not just as the reliable one, but as someone worth holding on to. I walked into that moment believing, against reason, that this was the start of something new. That illusion shattered fast. Dinner had ended, the kind of meal where the conversation skimmed the surface, weather, politics, half-hearted laughter at Jason's recycled stories. The clinking of silverware had barely stopped when my dad cleared his throat. The sound was small, but heavy, the kind of prelude that makes every head turn. He pushed his chair back slightly, folded his hands on the table, and looked straight at me. "We're asking Emily," he said, voice steady, "to help us keep the vineyard alive. Just $100,000 to cover the debts Jason couldn't manage." Silence spread across the table like spilled wine. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that the ringing in my ears had twisted the words. But then Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that smug half-smile that said the deal had already been signed. My mom leaned in, her tone softer, coaxing. "Think of it as an investment," she said, as if she were offering me a good deal instead of demanding my savings. "You'll get it back when the vineyard thrives again." My chest burned so hot, it felt like my ribs might crack. $100,000. They said it so casually, as though it were pocket change, as though I hadn't spent years grinding for every cent in my account. I wasn't a trust fund. I wasn't a bank. I was 23, finally steadying my feet, finally breathing after years of scraping by. And they wanted me to toss it all into Jason's bottomless pit. The worst part wasn't the number. It was the assumption. The way the words came out without hesitation. Like my role in this family had always been to bail out their chosen son. No one had asked me if I wanted to. No one even paused to consider how it might feel. They looked at me like a faucet they could turn on, expecting money to flow. I scanned the table. My uncles avoided my eyes, swirling the last of their wine. My aunts whispered behind their hands. My cousins shifted in their seats, waiting for drama, but unwilling to speak up. And in the center of it all, Jason reclined like a king, not embarrassed, not apologetic, just satisfied, as though my contribution was overdue. I felt something sharp rise in my throat. Rage, yes, but also humiliation. Like I'd been stripped down in front of everyone. The promotion I'd worked so hard for, the independence I'd fought to build, it had been transformed into nothing more than family currency, to be spent on someone else's mistakes. I remembered the late nights hunched over textbooks, the weekend shifts at jobs that left my hands raw, the scholarships that only came after essays I bowled over. Every step of my path had been carved by sacrifice, by choosing necessity over luxury. Meanwhile, Jason burned through opportunity after opportunity, failing upward because my parents refused to let gravity touch him. And now, here he was, watching me, waiting for me to fund his survival. My dad's gaze never wavered, his jaw set as though this request were logical, inevitable. My mom's hand rested lightly on the tablecloth, fingers tapping in that familiar rhythm she used when she thought she was being reasonable. Reasonable. That word stabbed at me. What was reasonable about asking your daughter, barely into adulthood, to give away $100,000? What was reasonable about covering for a son who had already proven he couldn't manage responsibility? I wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck in my chest. Instead, my voice came out low, almost shaking with the effort to hold steady. 100,000. I repeated, tasting the absurdity of it. The room stayed still, waiting for me to say yes, waiting for me to comply, as if there had never been another possible outcome. Jason leaned forward finally, his grin widening. It's not that much, Eam. You've got a good job now. And once the Vineyard's back on track, you'll double it. His words dripped with entitlement. A casual dismissal of my sweat, my grind, my reality. I wanted to reach across the table and shake him, to force him to see the difference between earned money and handed-down money. But more than that, I wanted to shake my parents, to make them understand that this wasn't pride. They weren't proud of me. They were harvesting me. I sat there, the heat in my chest spreading into my hands, my fingertips trembling under the table. I thought of all the times I'd accepted their favoritism quietly, telling myself I could live with it. I thought of every insult disguised as advice, every dismissal dressed as encouragement, and I realized, sitting in that suffocating silence, that this wasn't just another small slight. This was the culmination. The ask wasn't just money. It was confirmation that in their eyes, my value existed only in service to Jason. And for the first time in my life, the anger that surged through me was bigger than my fear of disappointing them. I stood up slowly, not in a burst of outrage, but with the deliberate calm of someone who finally knows what must be done. The legs of my chair scraped against the hardwood, the sound sharp enough to slice through the hush that had fallen over the room. Every eye followed me as I slipped my hand into my bag. My pulse thudded steady, not wild like before, but heavy, each beat a reminder that this was the moment I had rehearsed in silence 100 times. Actually, I said, letting the words stretch, quiet, but undeniable. I brought something. I drew out the envelope, plain and white, though it might as well have been a grenade. I held it between two fingers, the way you might hold something fragile, then placed it on the table in front of my parents. The soft thud it made on the wood was louder than any shout I could have managed. My father frowned, puzzled. My mother's brows arched, hopeful, as if I were about to reveal a check neatly written in their favor. But when she slid the flap open and pulled out the glossy photographs, the entire room shifted. Gasps, small but sharp, rippled down the table. My cousins leaned in closer, curious. My aunts tilted their heads, whispering. Even my uncles, so careful to remain neutral, let out low murmurs. Jason's jaw actually dropped, his smug mask dissolving into disbelief. His hands, usually so restless, froze against the tablecloth. My father stared at the photographs, his mouth parting slightly. My mother blinked hard, as though she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Each photo gleamed under the dining room lights. My mountain cabin, my choice, my future, shone back at them. Timber beams catching the sun, glass windows reflecting endless sky, the porch framed by tall pines that whispered of solitude and freedom. There it was, proof that my money hadn't vanished into nothingness, but had been rooted into something solid, something alive. This, I said, my voice clear and steady, is what I'm funding. I picked up one of the photos, holding it high enough that even the cousins at the far end could see. The cabin looked proud in the picture, its lines clean against the Colorado wilderness, a sanctuary carved out of my own sweat and discipline. My throat tightened with something that was not guilt, but the exact opposite: pride. My future, I continued, letting the words settle in the silence, not Jason's failures. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the statement pressed down on the table like a storm cloud, charged and humming. My father's hand hovered over the photos, but he didn't touch them. My mother's lips trembled as though she might protest, but no sound emerged. Jason stared at me with something raw in his eyes. Anger, yes, but also the stunned recognition that I had outmaneuvered him. The cabin photos gleamed back at all of them, undeniable evidence that I had chosen differently, that I had taken the path they never imagined for me. Not sacrifice, not servitude, but sovereignty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The power was in the reveal, in showing them that while they plotted to harvest my success for Jason's sake, I had already planted it elsewhere. They were too late. My roots had sunk into different soil, strong and untouchable. I could feel the tension across the table, the way the air had thickened. My cousins exchanged looks, some impressed, others wary, all of them aware they were witnessing a shift in the family script. For once, Jason wasn't the center. For once, I wasn't the afterthought. The photos lay scattered across the tablecloth, their glossy surfaces catching the chandelier light, casting reflections like shards of glass. My parents stared down at them as if they were looking at betrayal. But what they were really seeing was independence made visible. They saw the years they had overlooked me crystallized into something they couldn't control or redirect. I stood straighter, the heat in my chest no longer burning but solidifying into steel. They wanted my money. They wanted me to be the quiet solution to their favorite son's wreckage. Instead, I had handed them proof that I no longer existed inside that role. The silence stretched. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't mine to fill anymore. I let it linger. Let them sit in it. Let them feel the absence of the easy compliance they had always expected. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking from the photos to me and back again. My mother finally set the envelope down, her fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. Jason leaned back again, but this time his smugness was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle fury that looked a lot like fear. And me? I breathed, steady and slow, knowing that for the first time, the table belonged to me. The silence was thick enough to choke on. It clung to the air, heavy and unmoving, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shock of what I had done. My mother blinked too quickly, lashes fluttering like broken wings, her eyes shining as though tears might spill if she allowed herself the weakness. My father's face burned a mottled red, the color creeping up his neck into his ears. He looked as if he had been slapped, not by my words, but by the undeniable fact that I had chosen myself instead of his plan. And then Jason's voice cut through, brittle and bitter. Selfish. He spat it like it was the only word he could grasp, as though the syllables might still bend the narrative back to where he was the victim, the one deserving of sympathy. His lips curled, his arms crossed, but the weight behind the insult was hollow. It landed in the silence and slid off me like water on stone. For once, the word didn't sting. I wasn't selfish. I was free. The realization settled deep, humming in my bones, brighter than anger, steadier than defiance. Saying no had always been painted as betrayal in this family, betrayal of Jason, betrayal of unity, betrayal of whatever fantasy my parents clung to. But now, standing there with their disappointment simmering in the air, I felt no guilt. None. The chains they had relied on, the guilt, the duty, the unspoken expectation that I would always be the backup plan, had cracked clean through. Jason had been handed everything: money, excuses, endless second chances. He turned it all into wreckage and debt, again and again. And me? I had carved a future with blistered hands, sleepless nights, sacrifice stacked upon sacrifice. While he wasted, I built. While he drained, I stored. And now, the proof lay scattered across the table in glossy photographs they couldn't erase or rewrite. Their golden boy's glow had dulled. My own light, quiet, unseen for so long, burned sharper now, undeniable. I gathered my bag, slipping it over my shoulder with unhurried movements. The silence stretched, thick with things no one dared to say. My parents stared as though I had walked off script, ruining the ending they had written for me. Jason muttered again under his breath, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. I turned, my chair left skewed at the table, the photos still glinting under the chandelier like shards of a broken mirror. I didn't bother to explain further. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing left to defend. And as I walked out of that reunion, the whispers followed me. Soft at first, like wind stirring dry leaves, then distinct. My cousins, the same ones who had always orbited Jason's charm, murmured behind their hands. Good for her? I caught. A hiss of approval that made my spine straighten. Another voice, hushed but firm. About time someone stood up to them. Each phrase was a spark, catching in the silence I left behind. Even my aunts, women who had smiled politely for years, who had pretended not to notice the imbalance, leaned together, their eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite gossip, but closer to vindication. They saw it too. The script had cracked. And that was the sweetest revenge. Not just protecting my money, though that mattered. Not just refusing to bankroll another one of Jason's failures, though the satisfaction there was undeniable. The true victory was deeper. It was watching the cracks spread through the myth my parents had built, the one where Jason was the sun and the rest of us were satellites. It was hearing, for the first time, my family acknowledge what I had known in silence for years, that the favoritism had been a farce, and I had broken it. Schadenfreude. The word itself tasted rich, indulgent, precise. The joy of seeing them wrestle with the consequences of their own blindness. My mother's eyes shimmering with disbelief. My father's jaw clenched. Jason's entitlement collapsing into panic. That tableau would live in me longer than any hollow praise they might have offered. I stepped into the cool evening air outside. The night sky stretched wide above me, pine and earth on the wind. My chest rose lighter, freer than it ever had. The whispers behind me still echoed in my head. Not chains this time, but wings. For once, I wasn't the shadow in Jason's story, the afterthought, the safety net. I was the one who finally said no, and in saying it, I had turned the word into something sharper than anger, louder than defiance, stronger than any yes they might have wrung out of me. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't spite. It was justice, long overdue, with just enough sweetness to remind me that sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones no one expects you to claim.